Live.
We're good? Okay. Hey, everybody. My name's Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and today we have a special program with historian Tom Clavin. And I should have checked with you. It's Clavin, not Clavin, correct?
Clavin is correct.
Clavin. And we're going to be discussing his terrific new book about Tombstone. And just to kind of get a commercial plug out of the way, Tom has been gracious enough to sign some copies of the book here, and we still have about a dozen signed first edition copies of Tombstone. So it would be a perfect Father's Day gift. So anyway, without further ado, let me just give you the formal intro. Tom Clavin is a #1 New York Times best-selling author and has worked as a newspaper and website editor, magazine writer, TV and radio commentator, and a reporter for the New York Times. His books include The Heart of Everything That Is, The Untold Story of Red Cloud, an American Legend, Wild Bill, The True Story of the American Frontier's First Gunfighter, Dodge City, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and the Wickedest Town in the American West, Lucky 666, The Impossible Mission, and The Last Stand of Fix Company, a true story of U.S. Marines in combat. Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell is Clavin's latest offering, and it tells the true story of the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Okay. The best-selling author peers behind decades of legends surrounding the story of Tombstone to reveal the true story of the drama and violence that made it famous. So, Tom, welcome. It's great to have you with us here, albeit virtually.
It's my pleasure. I tried twice. Was it look too dark? I tried to move the screen a little bit.
Yeah, you suddenly went dark on me.
All right, I'm going to go back to where I was.
It adds to your mystery, your sense of mystery.
Yeah, I tried twice. You know, we had the book tour scheduled for April, and then that had to be canceled for obvious reasons, and we rescheduled for July, and we just found that a number of venues had been unable yet to reopen, or if they were open, there were people who said, I'm still kind of uncomfortable about coming to a gathering. So
yeah,
unfortunately, this is the way I get to visit you is this way, but hopefully it'll be the real thing next time.
Well, it's great. I mean, it's great that we can actually, do this. You know, technology has been really good about these virtual events that we've had. We've done really well with them. It's fun to get a chance to visit with you.
When you think about it, compared if this terrible pandemic had occurred, 5, 6, 10 years ago, we might not have had the options available to us today.
Well, that's true, absolutely. Now, I first became aware of your work actually fairly recently. It was with the book I mentioned about Red Cloud, and as a kind of a longtime student of the history of the West. Ever since I was a little kid, I've always been fascinated, with the American Indians, and Red Cloud himself. He never really got the same press, as Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. But what a terrific book! And
thank you. That was the kind of book that it was not expected to sell well. I'm not saying that we didn't think we were doing a good book and that we didn't think that people would enjoy the story. But like you say, Red Cloud he was a very important character in 1800s America, but he did not get the kind of attention that Crazy Horse did, and Sitting Bull, and Joseph Brandt, and some of the others. So we were pleasantly surprised when the book came out, and it jumped, not only got to the Times bestseller list, but stayed there for 6 months. It was totally unexpected. And to this day, to talk a little bit of business, we still get royalty. Bob Drury and I, my co-authors, still get royalty checks every 6 months. So people are still buying it, still reading it.
Right. Now with this new book, which is really, I guess, as it's turned out, the third in a, I'm not sure if you intended it to be a trilogy, but it kind of worked out that way, didn't it? Starting with, your book on Dodge City, and then Wild Bill, and then finally with Tombstone. Did you intend for it to kind of form this one extended narrative?
No, not at all. I think, I started working on Dodge City in 2014, so we're talking about 6 years ago. And if I, at that time, knew that I was committing myself to spending 6 years and writing three books in a trilogy, three connected books that would form a trilogy, I either don't know if I would have started at all, or I think it would have been a lot more difficult to get off on what I think was the right foot. Dodge City was is supposed to be a one-off. It was a story of Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp and their young men, lawmen in Dodge City in the mid 1870s. And I thought it was a terrific story, a pretty much untold story, because all the things about Wyatt Earp tends to gloss over at best his years in Dodge City. So when that book came out, and I remember I was in Wichita, Kansas, and my editor called me and said, first week out, it's on the New York Times bestseller list. We were all so excited. That's great. And it stayed on the Times list. And then when I got back to New York to meet with my editor, we were going to talk about actually my next book, which I already begun, a World War II story. And he said, would you consider putting that on hold? Because we have readers who have been buying this book and who are saying to us, what's the next book about the American West that Clavin's doing? Okay, well, I guess let's figure that out. And we were talking and saying, what kind of iconic figure from the American West from generally that period would be of interest to the people, and that also hasn't been covered extensively. And that's how the book Wild Bill about Hickok came out. And then we realized that we had two books that were kind of connected. You had Hickok being the prototype of the early lawman, lone gunman type of lawman after the Civil War that led into Dodge City. And let's carry that arc to its conclusion, where you have the Frontier Lawman trilogy, where in Tombstone you're talking about sort of like the end of that lawman that Wild Bill was. After Tombstone, I mean, obviously different towns and different places had different timetables. But by the time that Tombstone came along, or the Tombstone story for the most part was over, you had fewer and fewer of these individual marshals and sheriffs who have police departments. Virgil Earp, for example, who was the marshal of Tombstone, by the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral, his official title was Commissioner of Police. So just in that relatively short period, from 1865, when the Civil War ended, to the events in Tombstone coming to their conclusion in 1882, there was this arc of the change and evolution of the frontier lawman as the frontier changed. So that's how the trilogy came about. It was piece by piece. It ended up taking 6 years.
It's interesting. It's a fascinating time. You talk about 1980, or excuse me, the 1880s, really as as kind of the end of what we call the Old West period. In the 1890s, you get the very tail end with Wounded Knee, and and all that kind of material, the Ghost Dance, and the last gasp of the frontier. And I find that time between, let's say, 1880 to 1910, maybe, fascinating, because it's the modern age butting up against the last sort of vestiges of the frontier era, and Wyatt Earp as a figure, the arc of his life is so fascinating because it goes through that entire period into the 1920s, of course.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I sort of see the Tombstone story, what happened in Tombstone, as a conclusion, where the gunfight at the OK Corral was sort of like that last, almost, you could maybe use the word epic burst of violence, and so the Wild West against the New West. But that's an interesting way you put it, because in a sense, too, Tombstone was also the beginning of something. It was the beginning of that transition between the Old West and what became the West of the 20th century. Tombstone sprang up almost overnight. The silver was discovered by Ed Schieffelin in 1877, I think it was, and then you had, just in those few years, Tombstone, the boomtown, and it became a sophisticated kind of city. It billed itself as the San Francisco of the Southwest. You could go down the streets and see French restaurants, Italian restaurants, hotels were going up, people were building schools and churches, theaters, concerts. Troops were coming to town and doing Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, and in that sense, it was trying to anticipate and be at the forefront of what was going to be the New West.
Didn't I read somewhere that is it true that that early telephone lines were actually in place at the time of the shootout?
And I had no, until I started doing research, I had no idea this was the case. But there is a part of a small section in the book where there's an incident that happens on the road leading to or from Tombstone, and I think it was when the newspaper editor, where there was a stage holdup, and he ended up leaving the stage and wandering for hours through the night, and he arrived at somebody's ranch, and you would think that the ranch owner would say, "I'll dispatch a messenger to let people know in Tombstone you're okay." No, he picked up the phone and called and said, "I'm okay, I'm here, I'll see you in a few hours."
One of the things I find real, I was just having a conversation about this subject with somebody else, and I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody else who's really interested in Western history, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of these events, we think about the incident at the OK Corral, this iconic, the most famous gunfight in history, really, and this notion that these events in the West were being mythologized almost in real time. I think we were talking about, it was the Buffalo Bill, his Wild West show, and they toured in Europe, and there was this instant mythologizing of these events, and sorry,
things were moving fast. I mean, you look at with Sitting Bull, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
I talked about the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. I mean, the Little Bighorn event was 1876, and within only a few years, you had Sitting Bull as an attraction in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. Somebody who had engineered. I mean, there were others crazy. As you mentioned, there was another warrior named Gall played a very important part in the Little Bighorn event. But here's somebody who had engineered, and certainly has gotten most of the credit for the massacre of Little Bighorn, and yet only a few years later he's a performing bear, so to speak, in a Buffalo Bill Wild West show. And by 1890 he's dead because of partly because of the ghost dance controversy and conflict and an uprising on the Sioux reservation. So things did move very, very fast, and especially in the 1880s. You mentioned, the 1890 to 1910 period. It just seems like if people think today in 2020, events are moving fast. That didn't just start yesterday. That seemed to have happened, after the Civil War was over. It just seemed like time moved so fast, and the West got settled. I think it was the Interior Secretary in 1890 or in the late 1880s who actually issued the equivalent of a press release saying where the United States government is officially declaring the frontier closed. There is no more frontier really, because this is part of the story I think for Tombstone, is that people had been since Daniel Boone in the 1760s and 70s had been moving west over the Alleghenies and the Adirondacks and moving west, and that had continued all through the 1700s, rest of the 1700s, the 1800s, and then once many parts of Arizona were settled, and where could you go after that west? California, that was already settled. So I thought when I was working on this book that to me it was kind of like a poignant story too, because you're talking about a different kind of America West was emerging from a frontier that had been actually declared closed.
And then you get that first generation of books on the subject. You get Stanley Vestal's Sitting Bull book. You get Marie Sandoz's Crazy Horse book. And a whole in the 1930s and 40s. Sometimes when some of the original participants are dying off and are still alive, but you get, from a historian standpoint, that must be really interesting to have these different waves of historians dealing with this material. You know, the early ones, you know, primarily seem to play into the myth.
They did. I think you're using historian generously. When you talk about Ned Buntline and people like that, for
Yeah.
example, I mean, they called them dime store novels, and there were other things they called them. But yes, but you had people like Kit Carson and Wild Bill Hickok who were having books written about them while they were alive,
Right.
and they were having, you know, these books portrayed or told readers about more adventures than these guys could possibly do. But the people were buying them, especially back east, because they wanted, the mythology was very real to them. They thought they did not, they were unable really to separate the mythology from what was real. And in fact, I think an example of that is in my book Wild Bill. Is you know, one of the things certainly people don't know about Wild Bill Hickok is that he spent a time, a year I think it was, as a star on Broadway. He came east and he was in a play with Buffalo Bill and you know, a couple others, Texas Jack and a couple others, that was called The Scouts of the Plains, and it was a huge hit. And it was all mythology. It was all mythology. You had people of different nationalities dressed up as Indians, and you had an Italian woman who was portraying an Indian princess, and you had Wild Bill and Buffalo Bill and a couple others sitting around this fake fire on stage, telling stories about their adventures, many of which never happened. The public ate it up. They were lined up around the block to buy tickets. So, and yeah, it's like you were saying when you began earlier. You had these authors who were coming out with these stories that were, to some extent, making an attempt to tell about what really happened. You know, especially considering you had some of the people still alive who had witnessed some of these events in the 1920s, 1930s, and even the 1940s. They were still alive. But including, you know, Frontier Marshall was the book that came out in 1932, 3 years after Wyatt Earp died. That was supposedly his true story, and it's a really cool book to read, but you have to take it with a big grain of salt. So there was a whole industry that grew up, and then of course, what did you have happening starting in the 1920s? You had Hollywood kicking in with its versions.
And Wyatt Earp was in Los Angeles at that time, in the early days of Hollywood, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, Wyatt Earp had spent a life wandering, not just his early years, but even his middle years, his later years, in the company of his fourth wife, Josephine Marcus Earp. And yes, in the last years, they were living in Los Angeles, and Wyatt Earp was I mean, one way he made a few dollars was he was a consultant to the silent westerns that were being churned out in the mid to late 1920s. And, you know, one of the interesting aspects of Hollywood, and I think it's very telling about what they wanted to do with the Earp story and other stories of Bat Masterson, Hickok, and some of the others, is that John Ford was a young silent film director in the mid to late 1920s when Earp was living there, and he employed Earp or used him as a consultant. And so you would think that when the time came that John Ford was, because Earp was always trying to be honest about what actually happened, for example, in Tombstone. I'm not saying that his memory was faultless and that he might have stuck. There's a couple of things about him in his old age. He might have believed more the legend than the fact. But when John Ford did his version, which is called My Darling Clementine, which in other respects is a really, really good Western, and always considered one of John Ford's best, he claimed that this is the true version because he got this directly from Wyatt Earp. And yet when you watch the movie, there are some wildly inaccurate ways that the movie goes off the rails. Let me just give you just one example. Doc Holliday survived the gunfight at the OK Corral, but played by the strapping Victor Mature, the sickly Doc Holliday dies during the gunfight. I'm not sure why John Ford chose to make a decision like that. But for most people, you know, when it shows up on Turner Classic Movies, they used to say in the movie houses, but you'd be hard pressed to find anything in a movie house these days. It's a different version, but people, it's enjoyable, really well done movie.
One of the things that kind of struck me reading the book was it's really not that far away from us, is it? I mean, I grew up here in Arizona, and as a little kid, steeped in this history, learning it, absorbing it. There was a wonderful bookstore here for many years on Main Street, just around the corner from where we are, called Guidon Books. And as a little kid, I would go in there and mostly buying books about the Apaches. That was my big area of interest. But, just getting back to this, the mythologizing of this whole area and this region. As a historian, how do you kind of sift through it all now to get at what might be considered the truest version of the story? Jeff Gwynne did a terrific book a few years ago attempting to do that.
Right. Yeah, and Jeff Gwynne is an extraordinary writer and researcher, and I certainly would recommend to people, if they haven't, come across it already, The Last Gunfight, which is the title of his book, which came out, I believe, in 2012. So it's been available in paperback too for quite a few years. It's a very, very good book. But yes, he and others faced a similar challenge, because you've had not just years but decades, over a century. Just looking at the gunfight at the OK Corral specifically, that's an event that took place 139 years ago, if I'm doing the math correctly. So there's been over a century of misrepresentations of fictions, embellishments, exaggerations. One of the things that helps, and you certainly know this, is that Tombstone had two newspapers at the time, had the Nugget and the Epitaph. And they were reporting, now each one had its own point of view. The Nugget was more on the side of the cowboys and the ranchers, and the Epitaph was more on the side of the Earps and the so-called law and order promoters or faction. But yet, whatever editorial positions they were taking, they still had people who were reporting on the news. So, whatever copies and access is still available to those archives really help. You also have, one of the characters in the book is Clara Brown, and I think she's a remarkable character. And if I hope that if people read my book Tombstone, that they will have a greater appreciation for her. What a pioneer she was. She was still a pretty young woman and a young, not long married when she came to Tombstone from San Diego, because her husband had found a job in Tombstone. And she was an aspiring journalist, and she started writing these, for many years in New York, I used to have something that Janet Flanner did called Letters from Europe, a letter from Paris. Hers was like a letter from Tombstone back to her readers. The newspaper, San Diego Tribune, or as the Union, published her rather lengthy and descriptive and enjoyable accounts of life in Tombstone while she lived there. She went on after Tombstone to become really one of the pioneer female journalists in the United States. You have a fellow named George Parsons, who was a inveterate. He couldn't stop himself from keeping a journal. He was recording almost everything that he came across. So I think one of the things you try to do is go back to as contemporaneous sources as you can, and you keep sifting through them, and you have to weigh them against what got changed, what evolved, like the game of telephone that people played decades ago, where you whisper something in one person's ear, and by the time it gets to the 25th ear, that story has remarkably changed. So try and go back to that first whisper or two.
Can you kind of outline, for the people that aren't familiar with the basic story, everybody's heard about this gunfight, but I think relatively few people really have an idea of what it was all about. You have this as you learn in the book, you have this clash between the cowboys, and I'll have you define what that really means in this context, versus the law and order faction, as you said, which is more of civilization going forward. And the cowboys sort of represent the old versus the new, and lawlessness versus modernity. Can you talk a little bit about those different forces?
Yeah, that's a big reason why I wanted to do the book, and why that's an aspect I wanted to emphasize, is that the gunfight at the OK Corral by itself was an exciting event, but it also it represented something that was changing in the American West. It was the new West or the evolving West versus the Wild West, which was in its last days, really. Uh, Cowboy was originally spelled COW-BOY, and it was a derogatory term. It was sort of like saying, you can't do anything else but be a cowboy. You have no skills. You have probably no education. Probably not the most intelligent person in the world, but you can ride a horse and follow cattle and steer them hundreds of miles from Texas to the cow town where they're going to be bought and eventually sent to processing plants. And then when you get paid off, you want to raise some heck in the town and drink and visit brothels and fire your gun in the air, shoot each other if that's what is going to be part of the entertainment. And and then you had the ranchers. The Cowboys, and certainly the Tombstone story, they were represented by people like Johnny Ringo and Curly Bill Brocius, who were like the most well-known of the cowboy faction, both of whom were rather violent people who did not want any constraints put upon them. When they wanted to have their fun, they had their fun, and if people got hurt in the process, that's just collateral damage. The ranchers were people like the Clantons and the McLowrys and others who, and these were not bad guys. In some film bursts especially, it really is a white hat versus black hat kind of situation, and it really wasn't. The McLowrys were not bad people by any means, and the Clantons were not really bad people. But they were aligned with the Cowboys. They wanted to continue to have the freedom to sneak across the Mexican border and steal rustle cattle from Mexican owners, sneak them back across the border, rebrand them, and sell them to the army and to restaurants and butcher shops. So there was as Tombstone was growing, and this is true of a lot of the frontier, as Tombstone was growing and trying to be more sophisticated and trying to be a place where families could raise their kids and go to church and build schools and things like that, and have your restaurants, and people could, make money from being business people in addition to whatever mining income they were deriving. That was the West that was evolving. That was looking towards the 20th century, and the Cowboys and the ranchers were these holdovers from the Wild West, and it was inevitable. I mean, there are other communities that probably could have seen this kind of clash take place, but Tombstone became that flashpoint where the Old West and the New West confronted each other. So you have that's more of the big picture, and then specifically you have what happened on October 26, 1881, where in the person of the Clanton brothers and the McLowry brothers, the Old West went up against the New West, which the Earps reluctantly represented. They didn't go to Tombstone to have a career as marshals and sheriffs, but they found themselves almost like de facto having to be the law and order representatives in Tombstone.
Yeah, they were the brothers, the whole clan. They wanted to get into the mining business, did they not?
They did, and that's, I think, another poignant aspect of the book, because Tombstone represented a family reunion and a bright future for the Earp brothers. That's why in the subtitle, the first three words are the Earp brothers. I wanted to tell about the relationship of the brothers. You had reuniting for the first time since they were young kids. Of the six Earp brothers, five of them were reuniting in Tombstone. James, Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Warren. And the idea was that they were going to have each other's back, so to speak, support each other with their wives. Everybody had a wife with them except for Warren. And they were going to become successful business people, and they were going to become respectable. And their wives would be, allowed to walk the streets without being looked down upon for being essentially common law marriages situation. But it didn't turn out that way. It was such a promising opportunity. In his letters to Morgan and Wyatt, Virgil would talk about the opportunity and the what was be happening in Arizona in general, and specifically in Tombstone with the mining boom going on there. And so if it had worked out, it would have been a wonderful success story about the Earp family and doing it, being in this thing together. But it didn't work out, and ultimately it left one of the Earp brothers crippled and the other one dead.
Can you kind of reiterate um, what, because previous to being in Tombstone, excuse me, uh, Wyatt was in Dodge City, right?
Yes.
What what convinced him to get out of Dodge, as they say? And it's interesting how that phrase has entered the lexicon.
It is. It's a catchphrase, and you know exactly what somebody means when you say "get out of
Get
Dodge."
the hell out of Dodge, yeah.
Yeah, get out of trouble. Get away from this before you get in trouble. Worse. Well, Wyatt and
Doc
had,
Holliday.
had and Bat Masterson were Bat Masterson was the sheriff of Ford County. He was only 24 years old. Inside Ford County was Dodge City. And Wyatt was never the marshal of Dodge City, but he was the assistant marshal, and in a lot of ways he was the head lawman, because the head lawman was the marshal was kind of like a figurehead. And ironically, after a few years of Wyatt and Bat teaming up to tame Dodge City, they were successful, and so it got boring for Wyatt. Also, from a financial point of view, they needed less lawing, so they were getting he wasn't getting employed as much as he had been. So, the phrase he used is Dodge City had lost its snap. It wasn't as interesting, as exciting a place to be anymore, and he was getting these. And Bat Masterson also he did not get reelected. He ran for reelection, did not get reelected as sheriff. One of the knocks against Bat was that he was too friendly with everybody. We need a sheriff that's going to be more of a tough guy that people fear. A lot of people could not help but like Bat. Not that the Bat was an effective lawman, but that sort of counted against him when they went to vote. So Wyatt left. He was married to Mrs. Earp number 3, Mattie Earp, and they left because of the letters that had become so enticing that Virgil was writing. Let's go to Arizona, and eventually, who essentially followed Wyatt Earp was Doc Holliday, because Doc had been in Dodge City also. Doc did it also because he was still dealing with health issues, and maybe the climate of Arizona would be good for him. The gambling was going to be part of the problem Doc Holliday was having, is that as the frontier was getting tamed, so to speak, more and more communities like Dodge City were outlawing gambling. Well, that's what he did for a living. He wasn't a dentist anymore. If you got consumption, you don't be having a doctor, work on your teeth.
Right.
Yeah, better off with a toothache. So Wyatt was kind of like the only friend Doc Holliday had, other than his girlfriend, Big Nose Kate. So that's how Doc Holliday ended up with the other Earp brothers in Tombstone, and which, I was going to say, I wouldn't say it's unavoidable what happened, but there's kind of like an inevitability to step by step as the Earps become viewed, and a big part of this was because of the editorial stance of the Tombstone epitaph, viewed as these knights in shining armor. They're the ones that are going to maintain law and order. We can't trust a lot of our law and order system the way it is. We can't trust Johnny Behan, the sheriff of Cochise County. It's the Earps and Virgil and his brothers who are gonna keep us safe. The Earps didn't want to be in that position. They didn't submit their resumes to get this kind of job. But it was as more and more people saw them in that role, they had no choice but to show up on October 26, 1881, to help Virgil do his job.
Now, when you approached and when you were researching this project, did you have any preconceived ideas of your own regarding this this whole era and what happened in Tombstone that were changed by your research?
Well, let me put it this way: because I had done Dodge City, and because of Wyatt's experience in Dodge City and knowing more about his life, Wyatt had a tough life, and most people just think that he was a famous gunfighter and that he always came out on the right side of law and order. Wyatt spent time in prison as a horse thief. Wyatt, when his first wife was, I think, like 8 months pregnant when she suddenly died, and the baby did too, and he was,
Yeah.
overcome by grief.
Right.
There's a lot of things in Wyatt's life that most people don't know about. He didn't just suddenly appear overnight as this famous lawman. Um, so I think that when I was finished with Dodge City, I had a favorable impression of Wyatt Earp, more favorable than maybe I anticipated. So I wondered if his actions, not just his, but the Earp brothers, actions in Tombstone would change my mind on that, and it really didn't. That's the Earp brothers made some mistakes, and you could say Wyatt made a very serious and uncharacteristic mistake on the day of the gunfight at the OK Corral that maybe made the gunfight inevitable. But I finished writing the book, continuing to think that Wyatt Earp was on the side of law and order and basically a good guy. He did have faults, there's no doubt about it. But I do think that it's justified. I do think the way that Wyatt and the Earp brothers, but especially Wyatt, has been portrayed for sometimes for decades in the writings of others, I think have been agendas other people have had. I tried to be as objective as possible. I mean, some Star Trek nerds like me
Right.
might even remember that in the original Star Trek classic series,
Yep.
with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, there's actually an episode,
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, in which they reenact the gunfight at the OK Corral. Kirk and Spock, I think, are like the Clantons and the McLowrys and Chekhov and the others. And there's no doubt about it, they portray the Earps as these really nasty, evil people.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. One thing that comes across loud and clear, in reading about this whole part of history, is that we don't really change much, do we? Central to the story is power, money, politics,
Yeah.
violence, um,
Romance.
right? Exactly.
Right, one of the subplots of this story is that Johnny Behan's fiance and Wyatt Earp fell in love. And so there was that kind of extra tension to the conflict between Wyatt Earp and the existing Law and Order faction represented by Johnny Behan, which was mostly ineffectual. I know there were some people who would disagree with that and try and champion Johnny Behan as being unfairly portrayed, but he was somebody who was in line with Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo in that faction. But certainly part of that tension was that, to put it bluntly, Wyatt stole the sheriff's woman.
One of my coworkers wanted me to ask you a question, which is a really good one. He says, ask him to discuss the women in the Earp world and the influence they had with the Earp Brotherhood. The women have a big role in this book, and also this is a second point. Did the women's low social standing, the sporting women thing, the common law wife, etc., did that impact decisions that the Earps made ultimately?
Those are both good questions. That's something also I wanted to make. I wanted to make sure the women were an important part of the book. I mentioned people like Clara Spaulding. There's Josephine Marcus, who became Mrs. Earp #4. But you had this kind of like this Earp compound in Tombstone, where you had Virgil and his wife Allie. Allie's a fascinating character, and some of her taken with a grain of salt memoir years later, even though it's not completely accurate, she has some really telling observations about the Earps. She said that Morgan and Virgil and Wyatt, they all looked alike. She refers to them as three peas in a pod. She couldn't tell one from the other. Very clannish, she called them, and that was certainly true. Morgan, when he came down from Montana, he brought his fairly new wife Louise, was there with them. Wyatt had his third wife Maddie. Doc had Kate Elder. It was called Big Nose Kate, and so they were part of this family. And even though, yes, the men were the ones, sort of like the decision makers, they didn't make decisions in a vacuum. They had to be, to some degree, influenced. Especially Allie Earp was a very strong feisty character. I think she really comes through in the story as that. And then you had, but so I wanted to portray the women as an integral part of the story. But sort of sliding into the second part of that question, the Earp wives were really, I won't even say discouraged. They were actively prevented from strolling through town like many other women could in Tombstone. And I think that was for when the Earps discovered in Tombstone that maybe inevitably because of the trying to be more sophisticated and economic divide that was taking place in Tombstone, that their wives were considered really nothing more than prostitutes. I mean, okay, there was, as far as we know, there was no official wedding ceremony that between Maddie and Wyatt and Allie and Virgil and Louisa and Morgan, for example. Certainly not between Doc and Kate Elder. But it was not uncommon on the frontier for people to basically be man and wife and be viewed as man and wife because they said they were man and wife. I mean, you had preachers and justices of the peace were few and far between. So let's cut to the chase. We're man and wife. But that's not the way it operated in Tombstone. We had legitimately, married couples, and especially maybe more so the women, were like completely disrespectful of the Earp women, and they should not be walking around downtown like they were proper women. They were as much soiled dogs as the women working in the brothels. And I think that was kind of sad for the Earps to confront that. It was one of the reasons that they started to sour on Tombstone. I mean, another was their businesses did not take off as they hoped, and of course the increasing friction with the cowboys. But the aspect of women in the book is an important component.
What did you discover? Was there much to learn about the photographer C.S. Fly? He's always interested me. He those absolutely iconic photographs of Geronimo's band. At that perfect moment in time. We have those photographs. And how big of a presence was he in Tombstone?
Well, everybody knew him, and everybody knew his photography studio. In fact, I think
it's still there, right?
Yeah,
I think it's still there.
Also, that I think Doc, Holliday, and Kate, when she was in town, when she was not in exile or on some other kind of adventure. I think she and Doc Holliday stayed at the C.S. Fly boarding house. It's one of those cases where he is an interesting character, but in my book anyway, a very minor character. Not because I don't think he's interesting, but because one of the things I discovered about when I was working on the Tombstone book was that discovering people like Clara Brown and George Parsons and some of the other characters and the mayor, who was also the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph, that this book could have been another 100 pages longer because there's so many other characters and you try and cast as wide a net as possible, but you do as a writer at some point. I mean, you have let's say it's a luxury to have so many interesting characters to write about. But there's a part of you, the more objective editor part of your mind, that says, you know what, I can't go on too many detours. I can't have so many people on this that you don't want people reading the book and saying, I've lost track of who's who in this book. So C.S. Fly, I'm sorry, he's in the book. He's a character in the book, but on a very, very small one. But you're right about his iconic photographs, where to this day still amaze people.
Somebody did a collection, a little monograph that has, all of the famous Apache photographs, and I picked that up when I was down there in Tombstone. Just a few words about the part of Arizona that Tombstone sits in. For my money, anyway, that southeastern quarter of the state, that's my favorite part of the state. I mean, it's just such a beautiful area, with the Dragoons and the Chiricahuas and that lush kind of Sonoran desert. Really, really gorgeous area.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm a fan of Hollywood, so I don't want to seem like I'm blaming Hollywood for stuff, but oftentimes when Tombstone is portrayed on the big screen, it's portrayed as being this dusty, old-fashioned, semi-ghost town, barely clinging to civilization, and the surroundings are barren, filled with dust clouds and not survivable. And there is, yes, a very tough part to that part of the country. You know it a lot better than I do. But it is beautiful in a lot of ways, and there's some descriptions of those surroundings in my book, because I talk about the flowers that bloom, and you have I don't know, you wouldn't call it a monsoon season necessarily, but most people would be surprised to find out there was a time of year where you can get a lot of rain, and it could be kind of dangerous when you have these gully washers.
Yeah.
So yes, people. I'd like people to know that the Tombstone area is very remarkable, and not the drab, backwards, dusty, like I say, verging on ghost town that's been portrayed in many movies.
Yeah, I remember staying at the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, a very famous old hotel, in the middle of one of those August, really a monsoon storm, and it was really dramatic. And but another thing that I just wanted to ask you about briefly, I kind of stumbled over the point I was trying to make earlier, but I remembered, and it's that these ranching families that you mentioned, immensely important to the state of Arizona, down by the border, and in some ways there are still remnants of those descendants of those original families still in place. And you read a book, like there was a novelist who came out with a book a couple of years ago named Philip Meyer called The Sun, and although he's writing about Texas and the development of Texas out of the Comanche period into the modern age, the kind of the dynasty family he's talking about could have been any one of these ranching families, and you get
yes, yeah, and that's what the Clantons wanted to do, and that's what the McLaurys wanted to do, and other ranching families too. They were not having active working ranches which employed people with the idea that we'll try this for a few years and then we'll go do something else, which is a big reason why you can't see them as they've sometimes been portrayed as the bad guys in this story. They wanted to put down these roots. They wanted to have families. They wanted to maybe see themselves as generations, perhaps, being very active and productive parts of the Arizona story. So it's kind of sad where there are other versions which portray these ranchers as totally corrupt. There was some corruption, and there was a some cases unholy alliance with these cowboys like Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo. But you're talking about a time, well, today or 1880s. People are not perfect. Sometimes they make compromises. Sometimes they do what they need to do to make a living, and that's what these ranchers were doing.
We opened it up to questions from the Facebook audience, so forgive me for kind of looking at my phone here. We have some questions coming in. But before I get to those, I wanted to ask you, you touch a little bit on the case with Johnny Ringo and his death. And you don't really read a lot in histories about mental illness or the suggestion of mental illness in the way that you do, in a very sensitive way, and you kind of speculate that maybe it was actually a suicide. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and Johnny Ringo was a very complicated character, and I think he comes through that way in the book. He, you could say on the one hand he's a sociopath because he doesn't put much value in human life other than his own, eventually not even his own. He also had a certain charm to him. There's even some indications that after the gunfight at the OK Corral, when the Earps were being targeted, that not only was he not part of that conspiracy, but he actually tried to warn the Earps that there was a conspiracy against them. He was also somebody who you might call him today manic depressive. I mean, he had these periods where he was full of activity and had the charm, but he also would go into these terrible depressions. And the story, the more popular story, is that it was either Doc Holliday or Wyatt Earp who killed Johnny Ringo. But the evidence would seem to suggest that that Johnny Ringo killed himself. And I use the word poignant again. He was probably depressed. He was probably drunk, and I think there was a part of him that also realized that by this time, 1882, his kind of cowboy, his kind of a figure in the American West was becoming obsolete, and the West was passing him by. And I think a lot of those things combined to him committing suicide.
He was kind of a has-been,
Yes,
in a sense.
well, he was part of a Wild West that was becoming extinct in a lot of ways, and he saw it maybe to his detriment. He saw it maybe more clearly than other cowboys.
Mm. And of course, things like laudanum were all over the place by this time, right?
That was an issue with Wyatt Earp's third wife, Mattie Blaylock Earp, that she became gradually more addicted to laudanum, and it's we'll go into it more deeply in the book, but as he became, it became a cycle for poor Mattie, especially when she realized that her husband was falling in love with somebody else. And, she became even more dependent on a way to ease the pain.
Yep, we don't change, do we? I say again. These universals.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at Facebook and seeing there are a lot of people watching and checking in. Not a lot of real questions, although I'm pleased to see a couple of friends of mine. There's a guy, a terrific writer named Neil Griffin, who's a former policeman, who I'm going to see. He's tuned in. Good friend of mine, Steve Schwartz. A lot of people enjoying what you're saying. Can you give us, we're almost out of time, but can you give us a little hint of what might be your next project?
Well, some people may know, especially when we sort of early on, you referred to the heart of everything that is, that essentially I do a book as a solo author, and then I do a book with my good friend Bob Drury. And it was Bob and I who did this, The Heart of Everything That Is. Our last book, which came out in the fall of 2018, was called Valley Forge, which doesn't probably need much explanation what that's about. So my next book is going to be one with Bob Drury. It'll be at the beginning of 2021, and it's called Blood and Treasure. And it's Daniel Boone and the fight for America's first frontier. It's about Daniel Boone and others crossing the Cumberland Gap into what became Kentucky, the Ohio Valley, places like that, and then got caught in the American Revolution. And most people know the name Daniel Boone. A lot of people confuse him with Davy Crockett. But Daniel Boone was an extremely important character in the American frontier in the 1770s, and during the American Revolution. I mean, the Battle of Boonesboro, obviously named after him, which was a long siege in which Boone and a bunch of settlers held out against the British and Indian armies. If they had lost, if that fort had been taken, that would have opened up the back door to attack George Washington from the west. I think it's a story most people don't know about, and that's what this book is about.
Was the story of the Alamo, was that Davy Crockett, or was that Daniel Boone? I know, I think you're right. I think we do confuse those two.
And Davy Crockett, some people say, was Daniel Boone the one who became the congressman from Tennessee? And no, that's Davy Crockett.
Right. You know what I thought would be an interesting story? Are you familiar with the story of the St. Patrick's Brigade, or the San Patricios, as they were known?
I don't think so. I mean, I know there was during the Civil War, there was the Irish Brigade.
That's it.
The Fighting 69th was I think, part of or connected to the Irish Brigade. And the Irish Brigade were they, now, we could be talking about two different things. I thought they were were they from New York or from Michigan?
Well, they were the group that crossed over the border and switched allegiance and joined the Mexicans to fight the American, because they didn't want to kill people that were Catholics.
Okay.
That was part of the region. Really interesting story. There have been a couple of minor books, but the West is just so full of these fascinating little side stories. I'm sure as a historian, you're finding things all the time that pique your interest.
Well, I am. I mean, thank goodness for that. And I get to jump around. It can be kind of disconcerting on a daily basis, but I get to jump around in time. So it gets. I can be rather confused easily because, for example, when I was finishing up Tombstone, I'm in 1880s Arizona. I'm working on the Daniel Boone books. I'm in the 1770s in Kentucky and Ohio, and my next solo book is a World War II story. The one I had to put aside in 2016 or 17 once Dodge City came out, and I finally had a chance to go back to it. And so I've also been spending time in France and Germany in 1944. So
Wow.
I consider myself lucky, but I could be rather confused at times.
Wow. You know, before we close, you just said something that sparked a memory. We were talking a little bit earlier about the Buffalo Bills traveling Wild West shows in Europe and so forth. He passed away some years ago, a writer named James Welch. Do you know his work at all? He wrote a novel called Fool's Crow. Really terrific. He was Blackfeet. But he told me this great story about how he was on a book tour in France and signing books, and all of a sudden this obviously American Indian man walked up to him and had him sign a book, and he told him this fascinating story about how he was descended from one of these Indians that went AWOL in Europe while on one of these Buffalo Bill tours, and he disappeared and ended up marrying a French woman and establishing himself in France. And so, fascinating stuff.
Well, thankfully, there are a lot of stories out there, and I wish I could get to. I mean, I have a whole file of stories that I would love to get to. I would have to live as long as Methuselah to do that, which is not particularly attractive. But I'm always, encouraging other writers to say, look for the story or let the story come to you. There's a lot, even with all the books being published, there's a lot of wonderful stories that yet have to be told.
Right. Well, hey, Tom, thanks so much for taking time out to spend a little time with us today and talk about your new book, and really had a lot of fun talking with you.
I did too, and I'm really hoping, again, who knows what's going to happen the rest of this year, but next spring, if everything is okay, I've got that book, Blood and Treasure, coming out, and the Tombstone paperback. So I'm really hoping that brings me to your neck of the woods, and I can actually see people in person.
That would be fantastic. Thanks a lot, and have a great evening. I know it's late where you are, and I'll go ahead and sign off and say thanks a lot to everybody who's watching on Facebook, and we'll talk to you soon, Tom. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
You bet. All right. So sorry, everybody. I'm kind of a solo act here, but in case you missed it, we do still have some signed copies of Tombstone. Terrific book. Have about a dozen of them left. So thanks so much, everybody.